We now move on to the final session of the day, which would be evidence that is going to be led by Mr. Paul Holden on the context of the arms deal in South Africa more specifically.
This is the first session of evidence that will be led in regard to the context of the arms deal. In this session, as Mr. Feinstein foreshadowed, we have Mr. Paul Holden, who stands ready to give his evidence. During the session itself will set out the facts arising during South Africa's transition from apartheid to our constitutional dispensation, and it will explain the manner in which the arms deal came to be. Proceeding then to the first session, there are four broad topics that the evidence in this session will traverse. The first one is the prehistory of the arms deal. The second is the irrationality of the arms deal when regard is had to two documents, the Defense Review and the Defense White Paper, which Paul will explain in more detail. The third is the irrationality of the deal from the perspective of South Africa's economic context at the time, as well as an additional document known as the Affordability Report, which Paul will also explain. Finally, the fourth aspect of this session will deal with the irrationality of the deal from the perspective of offsets, which we will hopefully hear more from Paul about. So if I can then move over to you, Paul, please. Thanks very much for being here in the first place. Mr. Feinstein's already given us a taste of your experience and your many skills as a researcher, but if you could tell us a little bit more about your background, particularly the background that puts you in a position to assist this tribunal in its task.
Thank you. Thank you to the members of the panel and everybody for hosting this event. So my background, I studied history at the university just over there, way back when I was much younger. Since then, I've published a number of books on South African and global politics, including 2 books on the South African arms deal. The first one was called The Arms Deal in Your Pocket, which I admit probably doesn't fit into many pockets because it was over 400 pages long. The second one was The Devil in the Detail, How the Arms Deal Changed Everything, which I co-authored with one of the witnesses yesterday, Henny van Vuren. Since then, I've worked with Andrew Feinstein quite extensively as the Director of Investigations at Corruption Watch UK. I was a lead researcher on the Shadow World. I'm also the author of a new book that came out last year called Indefensible, The 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade, which looks into the systemic reasons why the global arms trade dominates and disrupts our politics around the world.
Thank you. Thus far, we've already heard some things about the Seriti Commission. Can I ask you what, if anything, those proceedings mean for the evidence that you intend to tender here?
Sure. The Seriti Commission, I think, casts a long shadow over not just the lives of the people who were unfortunate enough to be involved, but on these proceedings as well. As the Commission, as you probably know, the Seriti Commission was appointed in 2011, 2012. And its mandate was to investigate a number of things, one of which was corruption in the arms deal. Another one was to investigate the extent to which offsets were fulfilled in that deal. The Seriti Commission reported its final findings after 4 years of I would argue, non-investigation in 2016. It released its report in April, ironically on my birthday, which was not a very nice birthday present. And the findings of the Seriti Commission were unanimous for the state's version of events, which was essentially that the arms deal was entirely rational, there was zero evidence of corruption in the arms deal, and that all the offsets that were promised by the arms deal contractors were fulfilled. I think I should state at the outset, I deal with this in the submission that I think has been given to all of you. I disagree entirely with those findings, both in fact and in process. I should also mention that the Sariti Commission's findings are now under legal challenge by Corruption Watch and R2K, Right to Know. I'm aware that there is somebody tomorrow who will be speaking to the specific legality of that case and also the facts under consideration. But to briefly summarize what the case is, what the case states is that the Sariti Commission failed in its entirety to investigate any of the allegations of corruption. It merely solicited evidence, heard it, failed to test it. And where it heard evidence that contradicted the state's version of events, it either denied its admission into evidence or placed no weight in it. I should mention that myself, Andrew Feinstein, and Henny van Vuren were all subpoenaed to appear before the Sariti Commission. Myself and Andrew Feinstein made a submission to the Commission which ran over 300 pages and had, I think it was, over 70 supporting annexes of documents proving what we think is very compelling cases of corruption in the deal. We decided, after a number of years of the Sariti Commission proceedings, that it was no longer worth our time to be part of it, essentially, that we felt that it was failing entirely in its duty and that it was a political travesty. So we very publicly withdrew from the Commission and made our concerns known. Amongst those concerns were the fact that a number of employees had resigned from that Commission, stating that the Commission had no intent to investigate the arms deal. And in fact, the real purpose of the Commission was to make sure that people like myself and Andrew and other people who've been critical of the deal never spoke in public again. So what does that mean for this evidence? The first is that I'm going to lead evidence today and tomorrow about the rationality of the deal and corruption in the deal. I don't think it's worth this tribunal's time, and I'm not sure that it's worth my time to refute every single statement in the Sariti Commission's final report, because that would take forever. I also don't think that those findings have much value from a legal point of view or from a factual point of view. That said, there was evidence that was presented at that commission which was quite interesting, albeit ignored in the final judgment by the judges, including absolutely damning primary evidence of corruption which is presented by one of the police investigators. So I will refer to that in my evidence. But I should also mention, I was here yesterday and there was a question of process and due process. And I think while the Sariti Commission offered very little of value to the South African public, it might offer a little bit of value to this process, in that virtually every single person that myself and Andrew mentioned in our joint submission either made a submission to the Sariti Commission or was subpoenaed or otherwise gave evidence. And not only that, they had access to our joint submission, which set out in considerable detail our own evidence of their corruption. So in a sense, we already have their response. And their response is very usefully summarized in the second volume of the Sariti Commission's report. And I'm sure if the members would like a copy, that could be provided, hopefully digitally, but by some other means if possible. So I think that sets out what I'd like to say about that. Where I introduce evidence that was produced at the Sariti Commission, I'll make that very clear. And tomorrow, when we deal with the more substantive allegations of corruption, I will also deal with what the witnesses who appeared said before the Sariti Commission of Inquiry, which unfortunately was very little.
Thanks very much. That will be helpful. Before I proceed with questions concerning the session today, I can confirm that your joint submission has been made available to the Tribunal. It is Annexure AD1. I can also confirm that the founding papers to which you've referred are annexed as AD7. That being the case, let's start then, shall we, at the beginning, the prehistory of the arms deal. Can you tell us something about the background in regard to which the arms deal sort of found itself arising? Can you tell us about the background to the arms deal?
Sure. I think I've often been asked, when did the arms deal start? Which is sort of like asking how long is a piece of string, because the arms deal is part of a long historical continuity. We know, it's very well known, that a number of the piece of equipment that were purchased in the arms deal the apartheid government had tried to purchase or had tried to acquire illegally, breaking sanctions during the apartheid period. In particular, the Navy had attempted to acquire strike craft from Israel, had also, in a very infamous transaction, bought the blueprints for a submarine from a German contractor, which was smuggled in the South African diplomatic bag from Germany back to South Africa. That was quite a big political scandal in Germany at the time. Generally speaking, the distribution of funds and military spending under the apartheid regime was largely towards the landward forces. And that was quite simple. It's because the function of the apartheid military was A, to ensure compliance on the part of the oppressed majority, which meant physically being present in places like townships. And the second was to operate land wars or provide support for land wars in places like Angola and Namibia and Mozambique. So when apartheid was coming to an end, certainly when apartheid ended, two of the arms of service felt that they had been hard done by during the apartheid period, one of which was the South African Air Force, and one of which was the South African Navy. The South African Navy very publicly and powerfully started stating from 1989, 1990 onwards, that unless we started buying new equipment for the Navy, it would become obsolete. And that there was an urgent, pressing need for South Africa to have a Navy. That's an argument that I personally disagree with. What I think is also quite important to bear in mind is what was happening behind the scenes. And I think Andrew started addressing it, and it was part of one of the questions that was asked. From about 1990 to 1993, there were a number of military conferences where the former leadership of the apartheid military and what would become the new leadership of the new South Africa's military were meeting. These were conferences they meet on the sidelines. Formal negotiations started in around 1992, 1993. And what was striking about those was that you would assume that the leadership of two warring armies who'd been contesting a struggle for 30 years would struggle to find common ground, would struggle to find some moment of reconciliation. But that wasn't actually the case. The accounts of people who were there at the time suggest that the military leadership at the time in the NCMK and in the apartheid military very quickly discovered they had a lot in common. And I'll read a quote which I think is very interesting. In May 1994, Business Day published an article. This was to deal with a desire to buy corvettes on the part of the South African Navy. And the article said, one ANC-aligned researcher related a story soon after the first meeting between the MK and SADF officials. To this person's horror, the operational staff of the two organizations, until recently mortal enemies, had a grand old time discussing the virtues of various weapons, rather than focusing on creating conditions for peaceful development. Militarists of the left and the right always end up having a great deal in common. What we see from 1993 onwards is a dovetailed effort on the part of existing members of the Navy and the incoming leadership of the new SANDF to start pushing for higher military spending after the end of apartheid, which was a very difficult sell considering that the apartheid military had received so much money and there were so many other pressing socioeconomic needs. In what I consider the starting gun of the arms deal was in 1993 when the then Vice Admiral Robert Simpson Anderson gave a very public conference where he said that it was absolutely imperative that South Africa bought 4 new corvettes, which are slightly smaller than a frigate, but are essentially warcraft battleships. That was then followed up by a confirmation at the end of 1993 that Arms Corps had actually gone so far as to send out tenders to various suppliers around the world to supply these corvettes. And I think the most remarkable date is May 1994, when Joe Medisa, who was then the new Minister of Defense, and who was one of the people who most rapidly became friends and close acquaintances with the old leadership, and as I'll show a little bit later, became entwined in some businesses with them as well. He rubber stamped the tender process and said, let's put it out to tender and let's buy this corvette. which at that time was valued at somewhere between 1.7 and 4.6 billion rand. And that's what I consider the start of the arms deal.
Thanks very much. So this Corvette purchase that you describe, Mr. Modise may have been a proponent of the deal, but as far as popular opinion was concerned, was it a popular decision or was it contested?
I mean, it was an incredibly unpopular decision at that time. I think most people couldn't quite believe the idea that in the year following the end of apartheid, South Africa would be spending very scarce national resources on weapons. And would not only be buying, would not be sending these resources on weapons, but on weapons that the apartheid regime had wanted to buy for the last decade. So there was a huge amount of popular resistance on the ground. There was trade union mobilization, there was church mobilization, and there was also students protested. At that time, we had a magical period in Parliament where it was still very effective in preventing bad decisions taking place. And there were people like Max Sisulu and Joe Slovo at the time who were horrified by this idea that we'd be spending these national resources on Corvettes. And I'll quote if I can. Joe Slovo in Parliament debating this transaction said, "I do not see justification for spending what has been reported as 4.6 billion rand for the Corvettes, and this at a time where literally millions of people in this country are facing more than simple discomfort, because they are having to deal with the trials and tribulations of living in shacks, in crowded rooms, and on the streets of the cities. An amount of 4.6 billion rand would allow us to provide housing subsidies to 368,000 families, that is for at least 1.5 million people." The argument that was made at the time, and which was repeated until was actually South Africa's formal military posture for a decade or more, was that the greatest threats to South Africa's security were inequality, crime, and unemployment, and that South Africa faced no immediate threats.
You note in your joint submission that the Corvette deal was shelved. Can you speak more, please, to how this happened and why, and what was said about how the arms deal would be pursued further down the line?
Sure. So the Corvette deal was officially cancelled in the middle of 1995. The version of events that was in the public was that there was insufficient consensus in Parliament and in civil society for the transaction. And I think that is partially true. There was a huge amount of civil society pressure that did halt the deal at the very least. And what was secured as a promise was that we won't buy these Corvettes now. What we need to do instead is do a rigorous analysis of South Africa's defense policy, and then we'll consider buying Corvettes. Sadly, I've now come to the belief that it was not just popular pressure that was driving that. We now know there was a document that was made available to the Sriti Commission, which I've attached as Annexure HHH to the joint submission. I think it's also been printed for you, which I call the German police report. Now, a bit of background about this document. This was a document, a piece of correspondence that was sent between a police detective in Germany who was investigating corruption in the South African arms deal, and it was sent to the members of the MPA and the Scorpions. The reason for the transmission of the correspondence was to convey the evidence that had been gathered by police investigators in Germany. And what had happened there was, to give a bit of background, going a little bit further back, sadly, is that up until 1999, or late 1999, it was legal to pay bribes in Germany, or legal to pay bribes overseas in Germany. And in fact, it wasn't just legal, they were tax deductible. And they were tax deductible under a tax headline called useful expenses. What it turned out was that one of the major arms deal contractors, ThyssenKrupp, had actually submitted in their tax returns useful expenses. They admitted that we paid these amounts of money to people overseas, close to $30 million in total. And that initiated an investigation, because what it turns out was that their own legal counsel didn't seem to realize that they'd passed the point of time where they could claim a useful expenditure. They did it, I think it was a couple months after that became illegal. So they conducted raids on a number of properties in Germany, including the offices of ThyssenKrupp, and they gathered an enormous amount of documentary evidence. And the German police report is a summation by that detective, a woman by the name of Lioba Borowski, about what they discovered. And sadly, the evidence they discovered reflects very poorly on the origins of the arms deal, and I think sort of sets the tone for what the arms deal became. What they discovered was that as early as the 26th of April 1995, ThyssenKrupp, one of the major future contractors in the arms deal, had signed a consultancy agreement with a company called Malar Inc., which is registered in Liberia. Malar Inc. was beneficially owned by a man you've already heard of called Tony Georgiades. This is one of the great continuities between apartheid and the arms deal. Tony Georgiades, during the apartheid period, was allegedly an oil embargo sanctions buster. We know he was incredibly close to the political elite at the time, very close to F.W. de Klerk. I should mention when Thabo Mbeki appeared before the Saruti Commission of Inquiry, he was asked about Tony Georgiades, and he said, yes, I know him, and saw no problem with interacting with him. The reason why that entered into that was because at that time, it was very publicly known that the company he represented, ThyssenKrupp, was no longer in the running to win that first contract for corvettes. Instead, they were going to go to either a British company based at the Yarrow shipyards in Britain, or a Spanish company called Bazan in Spain. And those were the two preferred bidders at that time. Behind the scenes, it seems, Tony Georgiades was using his influence to ensure that original contract was ended so that a new tender could be issued in which ThyssenKrupp could submit a new bid and hopefully win, which they did. And I think it's quite interesting in that regard that when the corvette contract was cancelled, Tony Georgiades sent a message to the head of ThyssenKrupp which said, "Success, we have done it," which implies that that was his role. I think what's also quite disturbing that comes out of that evidence, and I think it's quite important for the commissioners to pay attention to this, is that in addition to entering into consultancy agreements with Malar Inc., it turns out that that same company, ThyssenKrupp, had, as early as the 11th of August 1995, entered into an undisclosed consultancy agreement between Tony Yengeni and Christoph Hunnings. Now, this was one of the pieces of evidence from the Saruti Commission that the Saruti Commission entirely ignored, and which I think sadly got lost in the noise of the Commission, and nobody's really reported on it. We know that the agreement promised a commission of 2.5 million Deutschmark. We don't know, sadly, the evidence is unclear as to whether that amount was actually paid, but we do know the contract was signed. Tony Yengeni at the time was not just a member of Parliament, he was also a member of the Joint Standing Committee on Defence. And I should point out that at the time of the Defence Review, which I'll speak about later, he was actually the chair of the Joint Standing Committee of Defence, which I think has the effect of tainting the entire acquisition process, even the process up to the acquisition starting. We know that that contract ended on the 30th of September 1997. So that was after the initiation of the arms deal formally, when the request for information was sent out. What that says to me, piecing that all together, is that it wasn't just public pressure or civic pressure that was pushing back on this corvette deal, but in fact there was already, from a very early stage, from a year after our first elections, a process by which multinational arms companies were employing agents and middlemen to apply influence on people they knew. And these were agents and middlemen who had influence because they were sanctions buster under apartheid, and they'd used that power to leverage relationships in the present.
Thank you. So once the corvette deal was cancelled, as you referred to a little bit earlier, what happened thereafter?
So as I mentioned earlier, one of the concessions was that if we cancel this corvette, we'll cancel this corvette transaction because we need to do a rigorous study of South Africa's actual defense needs. And that was done. So there was a defense white paper that was published, a short document about 60 pages long, that was published in 1995 after the corvette transaction was cancelled. And that was followed by the Defence Review, which was ratified in 1997 and passed by Cabinet in 1998. they're both very interesting documents. The Defense White Paper was authored by largely authored by a man called Professor Laurie Nathan, who used to be a very prominent activist in the End Conscription campaign. And the Defense White Paper was very clear about what the real threats that South Africa faced. And if I can, I'll quote from that white paper. It said, the government of national unity recognizes that the greatest threats to South African people are socioeconomic problems like poverty, unemployment, poor education, the lack of housing, and the absence of adequate social services, as well as the high level of crime and violence. I do think that that document has been made available to you as well as an annex to my presentation. That defense posture, that there were no immediate military threats, that the greatest threats were socioeconomic, domestic problems of poverty that flowed from the depredations of apartheid, that was South Africa's official defense posture for quite a while. The Defense White Paper was then replaced by something called the Defense Review in 1997. And the Defense Review again articulated that the greatest threats to the security of South African people are socioeconomic problems like poverty and unemployment and high levels of crime and violence. The government has adopted a narrow, conventional approach to defense. There is no foreseeable major external military threat to South Africa in the short to medium term. Now, this would imply, if you were to believe these papers, that an arms deal was very unlikely at that point, that in fact an arms deal would be irrational. And certainly this provides our test of rationality, or certainly my test of rationality, is if the greatest threats to South Africa are crime, poverty, and unemployment, and you pursue a transaction related to national security, if you pursue that transaction and it increases unemployment, it has an impact on the economy, it makes inequality worse, then you've made the country less safe. You have failed to provide security on your own terms.
Thank you. Is there anything more about the Defense Review and the Defense White Paper that you would like to elaborate on, sort of in regard to key findings and anything more about what they say about the rationality of the deal?
Sure. So one of the things one of the arguments that gets made very prominently is that the Defense Review, which was approved by Parliament, effectively approved the arms deal. Now, what happened was that in the Defense Review, they produced an outline of what they would like the South African Defence Force to look like. And one of those requirements was the purchase of all the weapons that eventually became the arms deal. But there were some very important caveats to that force design. That was in the best case scenario, we would have these things. But what the Defense Review actually said, it has become apparent that national priorities and budgetary restrictions place constraints on defense expenditure. This means that the achievement of a sustainable force design of the magnitude envisioned in the Defense Review will not be possible in the short to medium term. The second thing the Defense Review said was that every major defense acquisition would need to be approved by Parliament. And that was because this vision was a vision and it was going to change. This wasn't a set in stone, this wasn't a rubber stamp for go ahead and do the arms deal. And this is the quote from the Defense Review, which is, "The approval of a force design by the Parliamentary Defence Committee, Cabinet or Parliament does not constitute blanket approval for all implied capital projects or an immutable contract in terms of the exact numbers and types of equipment. At best, it constitutes approval in principle for the maintenance of the specified capabilities at an approximate level." I should also point out that Laurie Nathan, who was one of the primary drafters of the Defense Review, after the arms deal happened and in the wake of the Tony Ngeni scandal, wrote an article in the national media where he very explicitly said, this document that I drafted did not approve the arms deal. And this is the quote. He says, "In Tony Ngeni's statement on the allegations regarding his involvement in the arms procurement deal, he asserts in passing that Parliament approved the Defence Review and thereby approved the decision to purchase military equipment. This assertion has been made frequently over the past year. It is fundamentally and demonstrably inaccurate. Parliamentary approval of the Defence Review in 1998 cannot be construed as a mandate to buy weapons." And this is, I think, the very key point. Parliament was not asked to sanction the arms deal at the time of the review or subsequently. It has exercised its oversight function only in relation to the charges of alleged corruption surrounding the deal, which effectively means that the arms deal and the arms acquisition was not approved by Parliament. It was pursued by Cabinet, and I would argue to a degree by not securing parliamentary approval, almost by fiat.
Thanks very much. Just to digress for a moment, in regard to the defence review that you've referred to in your testimony and your evidence, I can assure the panel that they'll be provided with a copy or extracts from that defence review after tea, I think. Can I ask you then, at the time that the defence review was taking place, there were statements that were made by Mr. Modise about joint venture partnerships with regard to the South African defence industry. Can you expand on that at all?
Sure. What was happening between 1994 and 1997 wasn't just that there was this very formal process that was playing out in Parliament in the Defence Review, as we'd hope. In fact, behind the scenes, there were a number of people and individuals who were moving to secure an arms deal, one of which was international arms companies and the governments in which they were based. In 1994, when the first Corvette transaction was announced, most of the navies of the world raced to come to South Africa to try and press for an arms deal. In fact, John Major arrived in 1994, and apparently the letter he carried and he gave to Nelson Mandela at the time lobbied for arms transactions. We know that Joe Modise and other members of Arms Corps were being taken to places like the UK. There's an organization called the Defence Export Services Organization in the UK, which is essentially a lobbying arm of the British government. And they flew Joe Modise and Tilman de Waal, who was then the chairman of Arms Corps, to meetings in the UK to push for arms deals immediately after 1994. And those companies started making some inroads in the South African environment. Their joint ventures that were signed. Most importantly, I think, is that there was a network of individuals who were very close to political power, who were already putting themselves in a position to benefit from the arms deal. One of which is, I think, becomes very clear from the trial of Shabir Sheikh. I'll deal with that in more detail tomorrow. But what that evidence showed was that as early as 1995, he's already having meetings with various different arms companies to try and set up a joint venture so that he can supply the corvettes to the South African Navy. It's interesting, he has those meetings after the Corvette contract was cancelled, which would imply that he knew with his inside track that a deal was imminent, that no matter what happened in the Defence Review, no matter what happened in Parliament, an arms deal was going to take place and corvettes were going to be bought. I should also mention there was a company by the name of Futuristic Business Solutions, which eventually won an estimated 750 million rand in logistical contracts in the arms deal that were set up in 1995. And that company was very closely connected to both Chippy Sheikh, who was the person who headed up the arms acquisition process. He was the chief of acquisitions, and Joe Modise. The company was beneficially owned by a number of individuals closely connected